So this evening, I'm very glad to be here to talk to you about the updated Aistear and taking a specific lens around looking about diversity, equity and inclusion, which is very relevant for all of you who have done the LINC programme. So talking about, I suppose, the overview of the session, that we're going to talk just a little bit about the structural changes to Aistear, the understandings of diversity, equity and inclusion in Aistear, and how that is, like, I suppose, really about embedding that understanding of diversity, equity and inclusion, that it's very much interwoven throughout the entire framework. And then Lorraine is going to talk about the updates from the Aistear Síolta Practice Guide. So as you will see here, these are the two covers. You have the Aistear framework and then you have the guidance documents. So I think one of the most important things to say is that everything that you know about Aistear is still relevant. You know, this hasn't been a complete redevelopment of Aistear. It has been updated. And it's been updated because we're a very different sector than where we were back in 2009. And I was like that working in practice, and Aistear just arrived to us in 2009. I think it wasn't 50% of us of staff had to have a qualification, that we didn't have the ECC programme. There was a lot of changes since then. So really, when we're talking about updated Aistear, it is kind of trying to move with the times really for us. So the updated Aistear, the things that are new, I suppose, is to see the 12 principles are taken out of the groupings. For those of you who may remember, they were in the 3 groupings. And the reason I even say that is that we're trying to draw attention to the principles in this update, because I think, like when Aistear landed to us, a lot of us went straight to the aims and the learning goals, you know, went straight for the meaty stuff as we perceived it. But the principles then maybe weren't considered quite as much, and yet they're so important. So we really wanted to draw emphasis on the principles of Aistear. So the principles are really kind of been pulled to the front and interwoven throughout the framework. And I'll talk a little bit about them in a bit. But we have a new principle on transitions, again, which is very important in terms of, particularly when you're talking about supporting children, you know, starting in the baby room, starting in junior preschool, senior preschool and starting school, and then all of those transitions during the day. So it was important to really draw attention to that. The other change, I suppose, that I sometimes forget to mention at this stage is that we've embedded words and phrases of Skehill in Irish in it. So again, this was a nice, I suppose, nods to Irish language and culture and heritage. And also, again, we talk about inclusion. It's to make sure that everybody in our community gets to hear it, you know, and to know, because often families who have moved to Ireland, they may not get the opportunity to learn about or hear it. So even to get the blast, to get the sound of Irish. So that's embedded throughout. The other part then, which is very important, is that guidance document. So in that guidance, so again, when you remember that the original Aistear and the book, that you had the framework in the first part, and then the guidelines for good practice. So now we have the guidance for good practice. So that's a really important document as well as part of the framework, because it discusses kind of the newer ideas in the framework in terms of, there's about rights and agency, global citizenship, sustainability, about planning and assessing and so on. So it's a very helpful document to help navigate these new concepts. So for us, and I suppose that the most important thing when I was preparing this presentation is really to think about, you know, what is diversity and equity and inclusion, and what does that mean in early childhood? And one of the most important things that we spent a lot of time thinking about and debating and deliberating about is this image of the baby, toddler and young child. Now, you will also notice we say baby, toddler and young child because it was really important that the emphasis was on all of the age groups. So I know with the LINC programme and with the AIM model that it still continues with that older age group at the moment. But it's really important, I think, to recognise the importance of those first 1,000 days and working in the baby room, in the toddler room, that you need that knowledge and the skills to be able to work with those age groups as well. So we continually talk about the baby, toddler and young child. So the image of the baby, toddler and young child And I think if we get this right, you've come a long way, in embracing Aistear. So crucially, it is about that respectful image of babies, toddlers, and young children as agentic, competent, and confident. So the first really important thing to think about is that respectful part. And I always say it, and anybody who's heard me talk before about this image and how it was developed, that respectful part is key. And we say that babies and toddlers and young children deserve the exact same respect that you give to your friends, to your siblings, to your partner, that they deserve the exact same. So when we think about how we act and react and how we respond to babies, toddlers, and young children that we work with, it's really about thinking, would that be okay for my partner, for my friends? Would I talk to them that way? Would I respond to them if they were upset, going, oh, you'll be grand? We wouldn't do it. So it's really thinking of how we can really see the competencies of babies and toddlers and young children. And really it's about building those loving relationships. And that word grow of love is embedded in Aistear as well, because it is that importance. And we know that when we're working with babies and toddlers and young children, the importance of those relationships. So it's about really thinking about their life stories, about that kindness and that consideration. And kindness is really at the heart of Aistear. Because again, if that's how we are treating those who we work with kindness, again, that it's really foundational. Again, that idea of the strengths-based approach, you're very familiar with that, and is working in practice, really seeing what they can do, and seeing that potential, their unique potential in every individual child. And then what we also have included is an image of the educator. So in the original Aistear, we had the adult. Here we have the educator. So with the educator, we really want to present the education, the importance of that role. And it's about recognising, again, that professional journey that we've been on. And again, looking at the number of people who were out tonight, really committed to learning more and wanting to further your knowledge, to be able to work with the babies and toddlers and young children. So that was really important, that there was that recognition. And this is whether you're coming from the role of an educator working in a setting, whether you're working in a childminding setting environment, or whether as a parent who's choosing to engage with the Aistear framework at home as well. But what is crucial, again, is that respect for the children and that belief in the competencies of babies, toddlers, and young children. So crucial then, so these, I suppose, it's really about having that same understanding, that we have that shared understanding of what is diversity and equity and inclusion. So there's some slight changes of terminologies, that with diversity, what we have defined it as is about the ways in which people differ and how they live their lives as individuals within groups and part of a wider social group. So while we celebrate that diversity, and respect that of wherever children are coming from, we also value our similarities and our connectedness. So again, it's really about recognising, often that we think of celebrating difference, which is very important, but sometimes it's just that they all like farming, or that they all want to be a Garda when they grow up. So sometimes it's that connectedness. So it's about seeing what brings people together as well, because children aren't born with any of these biases. They don't necessarily, they can see difference, but early childhood is, was this lovely, it's such a safe space for them to ask the questions, about how come he won't talk to me, or how come he wears glasses, or so it's really about valuing that diversity and creating that space for children. So when we talk about equity then, and there was that equity, we've changed the term in the principle from diversity, equality and inclusion to diversity, equity and inclusion. And that doesn't mean that the term equality is not in it. It continues to be in Aistear, in terms of having equality of access and participation and so on. But with equity, it really is embedded in the idea of fairness, of what is fair for children. and to address any challenges that they have because of their background or because of their ability. So we know that, like equity, I think we do it on a daily basis when you're working in with young children, and when you think about it again with them from the different age groups of what that might look like. So equity, we kind of think it really is about everybody having a chance to shine, because you're always going to have somebody who's going to be ready and be out in the garden first, and they'll always be first. But whereas equity is about giving somebody a head start, as in helping them get their wellies on so they get out first, or whether it's somebody who needs a little bit of extra support coming in the morning, and that it's about having the space that they can come into the office, have a little cuddle, have it, to settle into the day. If you did it for everybody, you just have you'd have just that chaos in the one space. Whereas when children need that quiet time with you and to be with you. So that's what equity is about. And I think that's why we reframed it, again, because of that child-centered approach, to think of what's your image of the child? How do you respect that child? So rather than thinking, well, it's actually outdoor time now, but it's say from the equity side goes, do you know what? I know he finds this difficult, so this is what we need to do to help him to navigate that transition. So it's really about bringing it down to practice and crucially thinking, I suppose it's that empathy and that kindness again, of seeing it from the child's perspective. And then we talk about the idea of inclusion. And again, that's so embedded in the LINC program. But that inclusion, it's talking about how with every baby, toddler and young child, that they're supported, empowered and enabled to participate and progress in those meaningful experiences. So I think the terminology that we use, it is very much based on a rights-based framework, which I'm going to talk about, and which we know in terms of inclusion. Inclusion is much more about being present. Inclusion means that you have the supports in place, you have the resources in place, that the child is not just there, which is integration, but that idea of inclusion, it's that they are part of that group. So it's thinking about how we can use the Aistear framework to think about how we're able to support all of the children to participate. So that rights-based approach, and we're very much, I suppose, becoming more tuned in to the rights of babies, toddlers and young children now, and there is much more awareness of the importance of that in early childhood. So you probably are, again, familiar with the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. So these are kind of the 4 guiding principles, which is summary, a kind of a summary overview. But even to understand these is just so important, again, that this really underpins the updates in Aistear. And when we talk about diversity, equity and inclusion, it's not that we're doing anybody any favours. This is the rights of babies, toddlers and young children, that to make sure that we are supporting them to be included. So we have the very first one. So these 4 guiding principles. It's so important to think when we think of early childhood, that caring part, to be cared for, to be nurtured and supported, to learn and develop. So again, one of the roles of the INCO is really about advocating for the child. But I've seen some wonderful examples. We've been out visiting different settings as part of our research around the consultation process of updating Aistear. But that idea of being cared for and nurtured, to see how there have been settings and on a Friday that they have, extra baskets of fruit left out so the children can take some home with them. It's about making sure that breakfast time doesn't just end at a certain time in the morning, because they know that children are going to be coming in later and may not have breakfast at home. And we know that that's what children need. They can't learn, they can't play, they can't engage or thrive if they don't have those basic needs met. So it's very important that we're tuned in. And again, it comes back to our respectful image of the child, because if we have that respectful image of them, it's not about going, oh, well, they should have had that at home, or this should have happened. That's not what happens. We're working with the babies and toddlers, so we know what we need to do to make sure that they are getting what they need. To be treated fairly and without discrimination, to make sure that their best interests are at the centre of early childhood experiences. Again, that's underpinned by that respectful element, and that their voice is listened to and taken seriously. So these are crucial elements to understand. And some of you will be familiar, I'm sure, with Lundy's model of participation. So this model is embedded in a lot of our policies at the moment, ensuring that the voice of children is embedded in policy and that they are consulted on things. So often we have to think about what does that look like in early childhood, because sometimes people think, well, students' voice or child voice is when they're old enough to tell you what they want. Whereas we know that when you work with very young children, they may not be talking, they may be pre-verbal, they may be non-verbal, they may not have the language to communicate what they are feeling. So when we talk about space, voice, audience, and influence, space is about the physical space of where you can listen to and listen for the voice of babies, toddlers, and young children. But it's also crucially that relational piece, that relational space. So you need to feel safe and you need to trust somebody to be able to tell them and for them to understand what you mean. So that's very important for us. So when we talk about voice, it's what that looks like in early childhood. And in terms of us as the audience, what are we doing with when we hear what children are telling us? What are we doing with that information? Do we come away with going, God, that was just a real tough day, or so-and-so wasn't great form today at all? But it's to say, well, what are we doing? What's our influence? And the next step. So you can see that embedded throughout actually, that we use those terms. And when you read it, you'll see that word about the time and the space and so on. So this idea of multimodality of voice, of when you're working with babies, toddlers, and young children, I always say we can learn great things from those who work in early childhood. And if we could take those skills and bring them up with our teenagers and our partners all through life, because it's not just about somebody saying, I'm not in good form today because I'm upset about this, that, and the other. You can't do that with young children. We have to listen and tune in. So it may be talking, but it also could be the silences when they say nothing. And it could be that facial expressions, that stillness, that they're being present, whether it is their body movements, they're crying, they're cooing, but really understanding that voice and interpreting it. And I think that's what's so important with the updated Aistear, about valuing those moments, that we don't have to be doing things all the time, being tuned in and as I said, that listening to and listening for the voices of babies, toddlers, and young children, and trying to interpret that. And again, because you've built a relationship, or that you are getting to know and coming to know that the child, that you're able to maybe say, he isn't himself now. I think he's upset because, or I see that he loves this, so we're going to try and do this. And all of the time, it is about your interpretation. So being very tuned in to thinking, well, what are they telling us? And of course, we have the other with voice can be, of course, using the different forms of alternative communication, Irish Sign Language, Love or Braille, and of course, all the fabulous communication through the arts as well. So when we talk about the principles then, so that interconnectivity, so the principles, we really want to pull them out because they're so important. And again, when you think about your work with babies, toddlers, and young children, what's important then? So when you look at the principles about relationships and interactions, so when you are being with the child, how that is so important for their well-being, how that's so important for their language. So really valuing what these principles are telling you, the importance of play and hands-on experiences of holistic learning and development. So you'll see the similarities, but what you'll also see is the new terminology. I suppose one of the new words was the idea of agentic. And it's a lovely word, and I think it's a very empowering word because we have it for the baby, toddler, and young child as agentic, and we also have it in terms of the educator being agentic. And that means being agentic. And these are lovely graphics from the guidance. And I think they'll be very helpful in terms of having this visible, in your room or in the setting. It can be very helpful to think of, to just be able to look and to remind yourself. So when we talk about the agentic baby, toddler, or young child. It's how they're able to impact their world, or how they have a sense of control over what they're doing, having the right to express their views, feeling capable of achieving goals. And again, when you think of the children who you're working with, how are we doing that? How are we empowering them to make those choices? Or how are we empowering them to have a sense of ownership? And again, being capable of influencing my learning. So it is about us listening and seeing what they're telling us. And even in the baby room, there's some lovely research out there about, people think with babies, sure, how can they be agentic, but yet you see these very young children who are able to negotiate who owns the toy, who had it first, and why I had it, and they'll be upset about that. And yet they know that they have to leave it behind in the baby room when they're going home anyway. So they've great competencies when you notice that, and when you're able to stop and to see that. So when you think of the children that you are working with, it is about thinking, how are you supporting them to be able to impact their world and to have those choices? And it's not, sometimes, we often talk about child voice and the rights of children. We all know from working in a group environment, children's rights is not about that they get what they want all of the time, because that doesn't happen in a group environment, when you're in a daily routine. But so obviously we're giving them choices, but we're also respecting what they're telling us. So if they are upset at having to have a nappy change, it's to say, well, how am I responding to them? To say, look, I know that you don't want to go and get your nappy changed, but how about we'll sing a song, or will I put your toy away so nobody will get it while we're gone? And it is that respectful element. And that's how you support them to be agentic, that they're having a say, they can have an impact in what's happening. So it brings us to that importance of relationships and interactions and slowing down. And I think this is something we all need to do in the early years setting, about slowing down and valuing all those moments throughout the day and seeing the learning. So when you think about the principles, it's to see that when you are taking that time to be with babies, toddlers, and young children, how you really are nurturing their well-being, and you're supporting their learning across so many different elements. So when you think about, what are you rushing for? What's the rush? Can we slow down? And again, it is about getting to know the child. So by advocating for them, you need to be able to get to know them first before you can do that. And we can't get to know them if we're always on the go. So it really is kind of slowing down and valuing the interactions and how important that is. So again, that brings us to another new concept, really, in terms of global citizenship in early childhood. And again, that sounds, gosh, isn't that a big thing, citizenship in early childhood? But again, when we see how competent and confident our babies, toddlers, and young children are, it is about seeing how we can support them to have those connections with people, with place, and valuing the idea of justice, equity, and human rights. And when you think about your day with young children, you can see, what is valuing justice? It's about talking to them about things, about helping them to share, to cooperate, to work together. So it is about acknowledging their evolving capacities. And that's a term that's used in the Convention on the Rights of the Child, about how we are helping them to grow and to mature. And again, Aistear is the framework to support learning and development. So we want to try and nurture them to achieve their unique potential, their individual potential. So when we talk about sustainability in Aistear, and we're developing a research paper at the moment around that, sustainability in Aistear as well. But it's a lovely kind of summary way of saying sustainability is about caring for themselves, caring for others, and caring for the environment. And I think it's a lovely way of kind of summarising and embracing all of those, the development goals, and to really think about what would that look like in your practice, because I think it's really, I suppose it would be a great program in itself, caring for yourself, caring for others, and caring for the environment. So when you think about that, it is about looking at the themes, aims, and learning goals, because all of these things that we've talked about, and in terms of those concepts around sustainability, which is very much about diversity, equity and inclusion. They link in with the themes and the aims and the learning goals of Aistear. Because again, these haven't changed hugely, except we've taken out all the numbers and we've halved the learning goals, which is great. So there's no more aim 1, learning goal 4, and so on. So I think that would be helpful. But what it will do is make us think a little bit more about, I suppose, knowing them more, really understanding them a bit more. So the interconnectivity then really between the principles, the themes, and the learning goals, the aims and the learning goals. So when we think about caring for yourself, and if you think about the children, again, that you work with and how we support them, so what does diversity, equity and inclusion look like in the daily routines? So when you look at, so this is a little one in our setting. So at breakfast time, so they self-serve so she was was having her Cheerios and was pouring in the milk. We had the little jugs. So she was pouring in, helping herself to milk so she could have it herself during the day in her own little bottle. But you just think, isn't that great that she was able to make those choices for herself? And that idea, within identity of belonging, of Eveness Cree, which is a lovely Irish phrase, gladness of heart. And she was delighted with herself to say that she was able to have this little stash for herself for throughout the day. For communication, she was able to express her choice and to tell us that. And when you link with the learning goals of exploring and thinking about that confidence and winning, doing things for herself as well. So those little moments, like how valuable is that in terms of support and inclusion? When you talk about caring for others, again, it's like, what do you do in your daily routines? So it's really about really thinking of how you have that flow in your day and that ease and that slowness and that calmness of recognizing the learning that's happening. So when you think about caring for others, and again, that's the early childhood space is so important for that nurturing space of modeling that for children so they can see how to care for others, how you need to help other children, how you need to cooperate, how you need to maybe help other children to reach goals, and how you need to slow things down for them. So I think it's the idea of caring for others, and in this case they were making the soup, but what are they doing there? They're, again, all of that, you can link it back and to think about how an activity like making soup, for one child, it is about those goals around exploring and thinking about learning how vegetables grow and so on. For another child, it's about developing access strategies so they can work alongside other children and learn how to interact with other children. For somebody else, it is about to convince them to eat something that isn't white food, So there's lots of different learning goals that can come from these, kind of, I suppose, part of the daily routines. And then we're caring for the environment, excuse me, which I think is traditionally what a lot of us would have thought about in terms of sustainability. So that's the third one. And again, valuing the outdoors. And we have included a new aim in exploring and thinking on the outdoors, which is great. But the outdoors, to think about that lovely sensory space for babies, toddlers and young children, everything is, when there is that space, that children aren't necessarily overwhelmed then by the noise and the lights and the sounds that can be indoors. The outdoors can really support that. And again, that's about supporting well-being on one hand. On the other hand, they are learning about life on land, life in the water. They're learning about how the planet works, how they can care for the environment and so on. But again, it's about how children are able to be included and invited to participate. So partnership with families is also very important. Again, recognising that slow relational pedagogy to build those relationships with families as well. Valuing the funds of knowledge from home, because there's great learning coming from home of what children can tell us. We have developed a family guide as well to Aistear, which will be very helpful, I think, for working in practice as well as being able to give it to families so they have an awareness of what Aistear is and what happens in early year settings. There's also that link about connecting with communities, and that's really important when we talk about inclusion. It's about that place that people have. We all need that sense of belonging, that idea, almost ocha, a value of place. we all want to belong. We all want to go somewhere and somebody will say, do you know, hi, Sharon. Everybody wants to feel part of something. So there's a real connection, real emphasis on that connection with the community. And also to recognise what children bring to the community. Like there's nothing like seeing a little group of children out and about in the community and see the joy and the hope that they bring into the lives of those around them as well. So it's very much about empowering them. So when we talk about the learning environment, and this is very similar to what you would have done in LINC, and in terms of that Regio inspired really about not just the physical space and resources, but also the routines and the transitions and the relationships and interactions. So when we talk about transitions, as I mentioned, and you know this is so important when you work with children who may have additional needs, that the transitions, there's so many throughout the day, but really valuing, you know, slowing things down and making them enjoyable experiences, and how you can provide choice, how you can provide agency, and crucially coming back to that respect you have from the child. It's like, again, for ourselves, if you were sitting there watching telly and somebody came and just flicked off the television, of course you're going to say, what are you doing? You're going to get bothered. But yet children can be, you know, whipped up from their play to go get a nappy changed or going now, home time now. So it's really about thinking how we can slow it down and to have that respect for children in those transitions, and to know that it can be hard, you know, that moving from one place to another. So really emphasising that in the updated Aistear and seeing that as supporting learning and development. That's what Aistear is about, as well as obviously the move to school, which is the bigger one that we've been more familiar with. When we talk then about play and playful experiences, that we've kind of categorised it into three: of free play, guided play, and educational and playful experiences. So again, making sure that your day is that lovely blend of those, that there is opportunity for obviously free play, which is all child-led, guided play, where that you're able to nurture and support their learning and development, and then those educational playful experiences, that where you are helping them to extend their knowledge based around their interests. So, which means about those provocations. So when you think of your learning environment, that how are you inviting babies, toddlers, and young children to be part, to want to be curious, to be fishrock, that idea of curious, and to engage. And again, thinking about what are your learning goals for that child. So whether it's with your aim, that inclusion plan, that maybe there are specific goals. So thinking what's set out and set up for the children when they come in the mornings. So as we say, you know, if your friends are coming over, you tidy the house a bit, you'd set the table maybe for dinner, and to say you would do the same, and have that same respect for the little ones that you work with. It's a big one to give a few minutes to at the end here now, but that we have developed a reflective cycle of planning and assessing. And again, it's kind of that it would really capture what's important. So it's really underpinned by that slow relational pedagogy, the importance of slowing down, of the relationships with others, and understanding that idea of documentation. The documentation can happen at any stage, but that it's meaningful and purposeful. So the first one is about noticing. And this is something that I think we do very well in the early years anyway, of seeing what matters. And we often do that. Those are the things you say to each other, going, oh, he really liked this, or Mary's better settling him now when he comes in the morning, or you notice those things. So those are the really important things. And they're great things to jot down, about noticing the uniqueness, their interests, their achievements, their intentions, their worries. So all of those things help you to build a little picture of them in that moment in time. Then to nurture those. And again, that's for these figures are from the guidance document and will be helpful for your planning processes. But looking at nurturing is recognizing, naming, and affirming learning. So what are their skills? What are their interests? Do you know, what are their dispositions, their achievements, their goals? I'm really thinking about what you're doing to nurture that. And there's examples in the guidance that could support you in that. And then the responding. So how are we planning for and extending learning? So again, when you think about what does your day, your week, your month look like, but thinking of all the things that you can pull together. I mean, the great thing I think about Aistear is that you can pull from a bit of whether you like Montessori, Reggio, Steiner, and you can pull it all in to plan a curriculum. And that's that agentic educator to say, this is what I think is going to work for my group. So to look at whether there's aims and learning goals that you want to look at, the cultural celebration, obviously the children's interests, what families can contribute, community connections, the routines of how you plan around that. And finally, then that one on reflecting about thinking about and interpreting learning. So I think when you think about these different experiences, the different instances from the different perspectives, how you're creating space then to acknowledge the feelings and the emotions. And I'm going to finish my piece on that image of the educator. And I think it's something that we really need to kind of empower ourselves as educators, working with babies, toddlers, and young children, because there's no point saying, oh, people don't value us. Tell them why they need to value you, because it's such a hugely important role. So as educators, hold a genuine belief in the competencies of babies, toddlers, and young children, and hold them in a respectful and protective space. They know the value of their role as advocates for the rights of children, and in doing so, they also demonstrate and celebrate the importance of early childhood education and care. So that's your role, and you're doing it now by being here. So I'm going to hand over to Lorraine now, and thanks everybody for listening.
Thanks a million, Sharon. And I am going to pick up on everything that Sharon has spoken about, but I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the supports that are there for you as early years educators to engage with the updated Aistear in terms of diversity, equity and inclusion. And I suppose, as Claire alluded to earlier, one of the very familiar supports that's available to early years educators is the Aistear Síolta Practice Guide. So I think as most of you have engaged in the LINC programme, you know that it's an online resource to support the implementation of Aistear and Síolta together in practice with babies, toddlers and young children. And while Aistear is the curriculum framework, Síolta is the quality framework. So they're complementary but different. And so Síolta encompasses all those aspects of quality in early childhood settings for children from birth onwards. It includes principles, standards and components. And really importantly, the practice guide doesn't replace either Aistear or Síolta in practice, but it serves as that kind of bridge between the two frameworks in everyday practice. And it draws the two of them together in a practical way and offers kind of suggestions, ideas, examples of how they can be used together to inform learning and development of babies, toddlers and young children. And one setting might have more interest in one than the other. So you can pick if you want to focus on diversity, equality, inclusion or the learning environment. Thanks, Sharon. You can move on to the next one there. So it really supports you to think about your practice, but it's broken down into 6 different but interconnected pillars of practice, and underpinning all of that is the curriculum foundations. So the pillars themselves, they're actually at the moment partnership with parents, learning environment, play, interactions, planning and assessing, and transitions. But the practice guide has been audited and it's currently being updated to reflect the changes to the updated Aistear. So the titles of these pillars will change slightly in the coming month to better reflect the updates to Aistear. But much like what Sharon said earlier about Aistear, everything you know about the 2009 Aistear continues to be relevant in 2024. The same is true of the practice guide. So the resources that are there at the moment, while they're being updated in the background, they're still very relevant to support you and your practice. So I suppose within the curriculum foundations, within the different pillars of practice, there's a range of tools there to support you as early years educators to embed diversity, equity and inclusion in your setting. They include the self-evaluation tools. There's examples of practice from lots of Irish settings around the country. And there's lots of resources there for you to think about, read, reflect on, share with your colleagues, and maybe even share with families at some point. And throughout the different sections of the practice guide, there are resources to support you to really think about and recognise and address any unconscious biases you might have, or anything that may be leading to help you develop equity in your practice. And like, you can look at those in a little bit more detail across all the pillars. But if you start with curriculum foundations, there's some lovely self-reflective activities there to really think about your view of children. And Sharon has done quite a bit on that already. And the updated framework really does encourage us to think about our view of children. But the resources on the practice guide really break them down into smaller, more bite-sized pieces of reflection. There's more reflective activities there to encourage you to think about the messages that your practice might be communicating to the babies and toddlers and young children in your group. You might be doing it unconsciously or indirectly, but you might be giving off messages about what children can do or can't do, or your expectations of them, or maybe you have different ideas of what's appropriate for babies to do and toddlers to do, and you're communicating that through your interactions and your body language, is often very positively, but it gives you that chance to self-reflect on it. So that brings us on then to the partnership and connections. And so I'll focus a little bit more specifically on how the updated self-evaluation tools will support you in your practice around diversity, equity, inclusion for the last few minutes. So the updated self-evaluation tool will provide lots of prompts for you to consider things like how you recognise and value the different family identities in your setting, in terms of the materials that you display, how you incorporate the home languages into the daily routine, even down to the storybooks that you provide. You know, are they inclusive? Do they have diverse characters and perspectives? So it's really breaking down into what your practice looks like and how you might be able to say, yeah, actually, we do that really, really well. Or maybe there's something that you didn't think of that you might like to include. Like the update, everything in the self-evaluation tools reflects Aistear and Síolta. And like in the updated Aistear, there's that really important emphasis and renewed emphasis on engaging families in decision-making and really encouraging them and empowering them to share their cultural backgrounds. So there's prompts in there to ask you to consider that. How do you invite families in? You know, how do you ensure that the diverse family structures are represented within your setting? Moving on to the learning environment then, like that, the updated self-evaluation tool is going to support you to think about, assess, adapt and enhance your practice if needs be, to ensure that it's inclusive, it's equitable, and that you're really creating those meaningful learning environments for the babies, toddlers and young children that you're working with. And it's really about creating those welcoming spaces where all of the babies, the toddlers, the young children, they feel valued, they feel empowered and supported to thrive, as Sharon talked about earlier. And, you know, part of the self-evaluation tools will ask you to consider your practice in terms of equity and access and participation. So how accessible is your learning environment? And it will encourage you to assess that from the perspective of the baby or the toddler, you know, in terms of, are things accessible? Are there is the storage low level? Can the children actively engage in decisions about what their learning looks like? Are the materials open-ended? Are they real life? You know, there's lots there to really break down what your learning environment includes. And then that leads us into play. And it's really giving you that opportunity to slow down, as Sharon said earlier, and to really reflect on your role in facilitating those meaningful and developmentally appropriate experiences. And that's going to look different to every single educator on this call this evening, because our practice is different in that it's responsive to the babies, toddlers and young children in front of us. And that's what the practice guide and the self-evaluation tools are supporting you to do, to think about the individual child in terms of play, you know. And Sharon talked earlier about that time and space, and that's really represented across the practice guide in terms of How do you provide that time and space to engage in play? Does your daily routine do that? Do you have time to observe children and notice what's interest and respond to their interests? And like, how do you balance that free play, that guided play, and those educator-led playful experiences that Sharon talked about? So all of those big concepts are broken down into bite-sized pieces for you to consider, one at a time or as a group, depending on where your setting is at. And that's the beauty of the practice guide and the self-evaluation tools. It's very strengths-based, and it will help you to work on what you want to and what you need to work on. So that brings you into the relationships and interactions section then of the practice guide. And Sharon talked a lot about this in terms of children's rights and children's needs and ensuring their voices are heard and valued. And this particular self-evaluation tool will help you to reflect on how you involve children in decision-making, in respecting their choices, in fostering their agency and their self-expression, And within this, and across the practice guide, but within this one as a whole, there's supports there to help you to reflect on how you support babies, toddlers, and young children to develop an understanding of fairness, respect, and inclusion. And they're big concepts. So, it breaks it down into how do you think about or facilitate discussions on fairness and bias through play and through stories, and even linking back to Sharon's anecdote earlier about going for the nappy change but not wanting to leave the toy behind, and talking to babies about that in terms of fairness, that yes, this boy does have to get his nappy change, but he does want to come back to that toy, and that's fair. It's about facilitating the experiences then that promote that sense of empathy and social justice through role play, through being a playful companion with the babies, toddlers, and young children. Thinking then about your planning and assessing, and as Sharon said earlier, it's about that reflective cycle. You can move on to the next slide there, Sharon. It's about that reflective cycle of planning and assessing. And it's about how inclusive and responsive your practices are. But what the self-evaluation tool and the practice guide in general is trying to do is to support you to use that reflective cycle, but by breaking it down into smaller points of reflection and encouraging you to think deeply about things like, for example, how you capture learning or how children are involved in documenting or co-documenting their experiences, and how your inclusive documenting practices inform that emergent and inquiry-based curriculum. And it really looks at those points that Sharon talked about earlier in terms of noticing children's uniqueness, their unique cultural background, their family structure, their language, and ensuring that the learning experiences in your setting reflect the lived realities of the children. The tool, I suppose, prompts educators to recognise those competencies that we're talking about in the updated Aistear, and really fostering that learning environment where children are seen and valued. It's absolutely strengths-based, and it's encouraging you to ensure you're seeing children's progress in terms of their agency, their interests, and the ways that they enjoy learning. Moving on to the transitions then, Sharon spoke about that just as she finished up her section. But again, it's supporting you to think about how culturally sensitive you are in terms of your individualised approaches to transitions for babies, toddlers and young children. It's asking you to think about how children's agency is supported by involving them in planning for their transitions, enabling choice in their learning experiences, and acknowledging that change isn't always easy, and acknowledging those feelings with babies, toddlers and young children. And I suppose it's about recognising the diverse ways that children respond to transitions, particularly for those who might have an additional need, or really those who have had they've had to face significant life changes in the past. So it's all about bringing it back to the individual child and the individual family, which is a common theme and a common thread across the entire practice guide, really building on what's in the updated Aistear. So I suppose the reflective tools, the self-evaluation tools, but the other resources on the practice guide, such as supporting positive learning dispositions, fundamental movement skills, all of those resources can help you to support you, in embedding diversity, equity and inclusion in your daily practice. And I suppose I've spent a lot of time talking about reflecting and supporting. So I'd like you can move on to the next slide, Sharon. I'd like you to think about how you're going to use the tools going forward. Based on what you've heard from Sharon and what you know about the practice guide, how can it support you going forward? As I said at the start, it's being updated. So continue to watch the space. There's some lovely materials coming, and we're really looking forward to hearing from you all around how they support your practice. So thank you very much for your attention this evening.